That's what I was thinking. Should asset managers educate their clients on how to write their mandates to make them, more ESG friendly, if you will? Tony, would you like to say something on that, or you were on something else maybe?
I was going to go back to this last comment.
Okay, we'll go back to this comment, but then I would like somebody to answer my question afterwards. And if I don't find a volunteer, I'll nominate someone.
I may get a backwards way of answering that. Some of the approaches that were used at CalPERS and CalSTRS and still are when they get into new areas is one that they might bring in an external consultant who is not going to be a money manager, but is going to be an advisor to the board, or they might be an advisor to the actual investment office. The decision is made really based on how open the investment office is relative to new things. So you can imagine that in the early 2000s, saying that you wanted to do sustainability was not necessarily greeted with open arms from some of the more traditional staff. So in the area of particularly climate change, they brought in someone, Winston Hickox. He had been the former secretary of the California Environmental Protection Agency, but more importantly, he had been a real estate investment officer at CalPERS. So he could be a really good go-between between the environmental community, a lot of the new science that was coming out, and could help the real estate staff be more comfortable. The other thing that happened at that time is I served as the vice chair of the subcommittee on investment policies. And CalPERS and CalSTRS both have a regular cycle of going through their investment policies. And so what they started to do was to ask questions that related to ESG issues and to see whether or not in their main profile in their investment policy they needed to change things. We've heard today a lot of the things that happened. So one of the things that they adopted was a survey of energy uses. So it obviously would be material, obviously legitimate question that you could ask your staff, and it's not only helped in understanding what was happening in their portfolio, but it also helped the internal staff have a more conscious understanding of cost. The other thing that they've done is occasionally they will put out a small amount of money, which they go through a very, very strenuous process to decide who will have the investment mandates. But the thing that's very unusual about it is they then will hire an external entity that is going to do the measurement. So they pre-decide not necessarily what the strategy will be, but they pre-decide what they want to know. And so they put the money out and they watch it. Now, at $200 billion, that makes sense. So it's not necessarily the appropriate answer, but those are all different kinds of approaches that they've tried to try.
Interesting. So different, almost experimental approaches to doing this and testing what works and what doesn't. Donald, you were my volunteer. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, the question to fund managers, and I think the consultants issue is related to that. For a long time, the fund managers have said there's no demand for this. At least a lot of the fund managers have. But in actual fact, the world has changed very quickly on this. This is now really becoming quite mainstream. And I think as far as the fund managers are concerned, there's a real commercial advantage for those scalable fund managers who can get in on this area at an early point. It actually gives them a very good competitive advantage. From our perspective, we are, as asset owners, are looking for, in very turbulent financial times, reasonably steady income flows. We are looking at, for instance, listed equities, fairly defensive, long-only investments, where we're looking for those companies that have got low leverage, that have got relatively low ESG risk exposure because of good corporate governance and safety routines and all the rest of it. And so those managers who can actually draw together those attributes can do it. And the other point was, the low-hanging fruit's already there. We actually own our own investment operation. And half of our investments are carried out in-house and half of them by external fund managers. The property management side is really interesting because when I was listening to Tony from the Empire State Building, it's actually very obvious how you can integrate ESG into your property portfolio. And if you look at what's happening in the UK market, there are actually substantial changes taking place already in there, where the managers themselves can deliver benefits for the investor, but also benefits for their clients through better water and energy and waste management systems. And so, the proof is actually there, and there really is a commercial advantage nowadays. But there is an issue with scalability. Large pension funds really don't want to go in for small-scale investments, and there is an issue there, and we need to recognise that. So the really big mainstream players, I think, really need to move into that area and take the funds with them. But as far as I'm concerned, as an asset owner who sees himself as an activist, I see my job as actually trying to persuade my peers that we should be much more strong about trying to change the investment processes within our operations.
Thank you. While Lemmy is speaking, I would like to ask my panelists here to get prepared to be grilled by the audience, because I expect you all have some very sharp questions and comments. So for those of you that do, just raise your hand and I will try to keep track of you. Excellent. Go ahead, Lemmy.
Yeah, just to elaborate maybe a bit more on the link between asset owners and asset managers. In a sense, you could think about ESG integration the same way as the interplay on the sort of general mainstream management works between asset owner and asset manager. And in a sense, the asset owners are saying, are giving objectives to the managers very upstream in the process, and if you translate that on the ESG field, it starts by saying you need to look at it, right? And then in between, the how you manage the portfolio is not really something that the asset owner is necessarily getting into, and again for ESG, how you measure the risk can be left to the manager to think and implement, but then you still need a last step, which is back to the asset owner, where you need somewhat to have a mechanism to measure what the manager is doing. And in the traditional space, it's measuring return and measuring risk. And in the ESG space, the equivalent at least would be measuring the risk, how it's embedded in the portfolio. And that seems to be a relatively natural idea to measure the risk at the portfolio level, but it is not really today systematically implemented by asset owners. So in a sense, we are still very early stage where there is a desire to integrate, but there's not yet a very robust and systematic way to measure what risk is embedded in the portfolio, and as a consequence, what are the manager doing to at least either mitigate or at least make sure that the risk is known and understood.
A very brief comment from Peter, and then we have our first question from the gentleman at the back.
Just quickly, because I just want to end on a positive note from one of my comments. We did a survey of RFPs, so requests for information, requests for proposals from institutional clients. And over the past year, 80% of those have had significant chunks of those requests for information detailing UNPRI participation and what you're doing in terms of integration. So there's a very positive trend there. The question I can't answer is how much importance the asset owners actually put on the answers to those questions.
Interesting next study. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Ben Bingham with Three Sisters Sustainable Investments. I think no matter what our time horizon is, I think we all may have children or grandchildren in the next 30 years, and we have a lot of problems to solve. And my question has to do with liquidity in the marketplace and how we can get it to move towards the needs of our time and the solutions for our time. You spoke, Peter, I think, about the average 7-month average trading time for holding. And that's against probably 40% of the market is long-term investors and 60% are trading every few seconds. So really the big problem, one question I have is, do you think that perhaps to take some of the risk out of the market, we should ban computerized trading? The second is, should pension